This case happened in Mexico. The witness claims that they were in the first grade when the incident happened. They do not provide an exact date, but given that they mention that it happened around the time when people didn't lock their doors, I'm going to guess that it was probably in the 1950s. According to her, it was just a regular school day. Usually during lunch break, she would go down to the lunchroom with the other kids and then return to class right after. On this particular day, though, she had forgotten to bring her lunch. Fearing the teacher would reprimand her, she came up with a plan to walk home and get her lunch. Some kids who lived within a certain distance of the school were permitted to walk home for lunch, provided they returned in time for afternoon class. I made a snap decision. I would just walk home, explain to my mom what I'd done, eat my bag lunch at home, and walk back to school. No one would be the wiser. I was still a little nervous when I left the building, because even though we lived close enough to the school, you either were supposed to eat at school or eat at home. You could only switch by getting your family's permission and having it cleared through the school. The witness claims they managed to get off the school property without being seen. It was a cloudy, chilly fall day. Curiously, she noticed that it seemed to become more and more overcast as she walked the last few steps down her street and up to her house. The witness noted that back in those days, they never locked the doors during the day, so she found it odd when the door appeared to be locked. I went to the back door, the way I always entered the home, preparing to make my "stupid me, guess what I did" speech to myself. I grabbed the door and pulled, but to my surprise, it was locked. The knob would not turn. It was shut tight. I called, "Mommy, Mommy," walking around to the front door. Amazed, I found it locked too. I started feeling very scared, so I ran next door to the elderly neighbor's house, Mrs. Beltran. She was always home. In fact, she would probably feed me lunch if I asked politely, but her door was locked too. At this point, the witness started to wonder what was going on, as this had never happened before. Where had everyone gone, and why were all the doors locked? She started to become concerned, even panicky. The wind had picked up, blowing dust and leaves around. I was cold, hungry, and needed to go to the bathroom. Worst of all, I had no idea what time it was by now. I waited a few more minutes that seemed like hours, hoping my mom would return from some unexpected errand. The witness walked back around and tried the doors again, and this is when they became alerted to a strange sound. I started to hear a very strange droning sound and looked up in the sky and saw a dark-colored airplane flying overhead, visible intermittently through the clouds, zipping by up there in the wind. This plane really frightened me for some reason, and I felt I had to get away from it, so I hid behind our storage shed until I could no longer hear it. Just as I was getting ready to try the door again, as if trying would magically make it open and my mom be home, I heard the droning sound again, this time accompanied by a deep, whispery, chuckling sound, as if some man were nearby laughing to himself. This became too much for the witness, who ran back to the school. She managed to make it to the school, snuck into the bathroom before getting into class. A teacher scolded her for going to the bathroom without permission, but aside from that, nobody else seemed to notice the trip home. The remainder of the afternoon, she claimed she was nervous at the prospect of returning home. I walked home, anxious and frightened. By now the weather had cleared somewhat, and the sun was out. Trembling, I walked up to the back door, pulled, and it opened. Mom was there getting ready to fix dinner. I told her what I had done and asked her why she wasn't home, and why Mrs. Beltran wasn't home either. She gave me a strange, startled look. I was home all day, like I always am. You took your lunch bag. I handed it to you when you left in the morning, and you know very well that poor Mrs. Beltran died last month. June 8, 2004. Two people delivering morning newspapers in south central Winnipeg observe a bright light moving in the sky. They were in the middle of placing newspapers in individual vending boxes When the object seemed to fly over them and come to a stop, it was hovering only 3 or 4 stories high above them. Frightened, the pair dropped their newspapers and began to run for their car. Just then, the object shot off to the west and disappeared from sight. The 2 witnesses quickly returned to their car and drove away. They stopped at another newspaper box, less than a kilometer away. Unsure of what the object was, they assumed that it was now gone, and they set off delivering their next bundle. Just then, to their horror, an oblong object with white lights moving around its middle rose up from the ground from behind a heavily wooded area nearby and began to fly towards them. It was definitely not a plane or anything else. I saw it very clearly, and it was something very strange, the witness told UFO researcher Chris Witowski. The object made no noise as it swooped over their car. That was when the witness noticed that their surroundings had taken on a very eerie character, as there were no other cars on the streets and not a single pedestrian walking a dog. Usually we see some sporadic traffic, even at this hour, but there was absolutely no one around at all. It was like a ghost town in the middle of the city. They proceeded to drive to an all-night coffee shop and ran into the store as the object flew over the building. They convinced the proprietor to go outside with them and take a look, but when they came out, the object had retreated and was only a bright light in the distance. After a short while, the 2 original witnesses calmed down and returned to their car to go back and deliver the remainder of the newspapers. About an hour later, as they were delivering more newspapers, they looked up to see a, quote, strange plane with no cockpit windows flying slowly overhead, making an odd, whining noise. They saw 2 more unusual aircraft flying in the sky. It was then something happened that they could not explain. Suddenly, everything changed, and there were cars around, people walking, and ordinary planes were flying over us. When they returned home, they found themselves unable to sleep. On the night of October 15, 2016, 2 roommates in Mississippi were sitting outside talking. They had flashlights and they were aiming them into the night sky and shining it at random trees on the outskirts of their property. At some point, they noticed what to them looked like stars, except they were moving, almost pulsing. They didn't think much of it and eventually headed inside. The very next night, they were again sitting outside, playing with their flashlights while they talked. The strange stars returned. According to the witness, this is when things started to get creepy. We noticed what looked like a triangular-shaped drone, but huge, coming from the church near this location. It was triangular-shaped, dark, 3 white lights at each corner, and a light in the middle that was turned red later on. No wings, and no sound. It hovered, and went in an odd sideways turn, and was gone. As they sat outside taking in what they had just witnessed, the object returned, drifting over the treetops. It looked like a plane from a distance, but had no sound, until it was directly above us when we heard a low hum. We didn't even realize it was above us until we looked up because of the noise. One of the men pointed their light at the object, which flashed a red light and then took off. The witness claims that within seconds, an F-16 fighter jet appeared on the scene directly over their head, seemingly following the same path that the object had taken. Curiously, later that same evening, the witness awoke at 4 a.m. and went outside to have a cigarette, and that's when things got really strange. He claims that he went outside and entered what he can only describe as a trance-like state. I sat outside, freezing cold, and couldn't move. I had an unlit cigarette in my hand for what felt like 5 minutes maybe, but when I went inside, it had been 5 hours. Upon peering back outside, they observed a figure or being standing there. They described it as tan and, quote, almost vibrating. It blended with the trees at first, but it was different. It moved and ran towards the woods, but when I say ran, I mean it was almost like moving at a rate so fast It reminded me of a slow motion effect. The witness later told their roommate about what had happened and what they had seen, and the roommate confirmed that a number of bizarre things had occurred that night, including hearing what sounded like something landing on the roof of their house with a loud thump, and then feet shuffling outside, and the fact that the neighbors' dogs, as well as their own dog, seemed to be agitated and barking at something.